Welcome to the HC Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking the energy transition, and our guest makes the case that it's happening much faster than we think, and the rate of change is exponential, and the impact on our global energy infrastructure, societies and geopolitics is going to be profound. Our guest is Kingsmill Bond, Senior Energy Analyst at RMI, a think and do tank in the energy transition. As always, you can really support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Kingsmill, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I am excited to have this discussion. We're essentially, I guess, tackling the energy transition once again, but this time from a very positive standpoint, a view that the energy transition not only is going to happen faster than we think it's happening, but it's already happening far faster and far more structurally than perhaps people recognize. And that leads us to the title of this episode, which is, the unstoppable energy transition. Before we dig into the core reasons about why it's happening, the rate of change that's happening, and where in particular that it is happening, what do we mean by the energy transition? Can you give us some contrast? You write about the age of renewables versus the age of carbon.
So I think the big difference between the way we look at the world and the way that a lot of incumbent analysts look at the world is that we're modeling the new, not the old. And we're modeling the insurgents, not the incumbents. And we're modeling the future, not the past. So the energy transition is driven by the rapid exponential growth of new energy technologies, of solar and wind and batteries, of electrification and efficiency. And as they grow very quickly, so they create these peaks in demand for the old system, and then they start to push fossil fuels out of the system. And it's happening in one sector after another, one country after another. And it's a very clear, clean process. Not to say it's easy for a second, but it is pretty clear. And I think what I guess distinguishes us from others is the energy industry hasn't seen this kind of change ever. But of course, technology shifts are something which are very common to many other sectors. And we're simply bringing that lens to the energy transition and saying, actually, technology shifts are completely normal. We know how they work, exponential change, S-curves, learning rates, new technology pushes out old technology. It's pretty standard stuff.
There is this crucial difference which underpins much of your work, this idea that, we're moving to an energy that's manufactured rather than exploited, for want of burned from another resource. And that with it brings this technological change, which, as you say, is not something that's happened to the energy industry, at least since Spindletop.
So, Doan Farmer, who's this Oxford academic, did this very interesting analysis, which kind of encapsulates the difference between commodities and technologies. And the point to me is that commodities like fossil fuels, the price has been flat for basically 100 years. It fluctuates, but it never really goes down over time. But of course, technology costs, because they're modular and there is millions of people trying to improve them, they're constantly improving, and therefore their costs keep on falling. And that really is the absolutely fundamental difference between the two types of technologies. And we just kind of crossed this incredible tipping point in human history where for the first time we can harness the power of the sun more cheaply than we can get energy by burning it. And that, I don't think people have even begun to realize the implications of this tipping point. So, we talk about this shift from the age of carbon to the age of renewables, and just to elaborate, what do we mean? Carbon resources, they're held by a relatively small number of people. They're finite. Renewables, of course, are eternal. The fossil fuels are geographically concentrated. Renewables are available everywhere. Fossil fuels, by their very nature, by the fact that you have thermodynamic laws, they waste 2/3 of their energy because you have to burn them. And renewables are much more efficient. You're moving from an analog system to a digital system. You're moving from a system which sort of directs huge rents of $1 to $2 trillion a year, according to the World Bank, towards oligarchs and petrostates, to a system which is much flatter. There are no basically rents in manufactured systems. And then finally, we're moving from a system which is killing millions of people, 5 or 6 million people a year from air pollution, to one which doesn't produce any pollution. So it's an absolutely extraordinary shift. And I, wish to get across this as a shift from this the age of carbon to the age of renewables.
And I want to talk about the exponential growth that we're seeing today, and you argue about. What is this? You sort of alluded to this idea that sort of old energy, are modelling old energy, and the new energy should be modelling, new energy, and that sort of disconnect therein about the way old energy, in inverted commas, think about this landscape. Can you just dig into that a little bit more?
Sure. So what happens is that the sort of incumbent old energy modelers, Exxon and OPEC and EIA and so on and so forth, they have these very complex, detailed models which they built up over decades, which kind of worked for quite a long time, because there was no disruptive force, there was nothing really substantively changing in the system, and they therefore introduce all of these barriers to change. Solar can't be more than a certain share because there is this particular barrier today, and the problem is that at times of disruptive change, the power of these new technologies is such that they're able to overcome these barriers. And we've seen this consistently for the last 10 or even 20 years, that as costs keep on falling, barriers keep on being broken through, models keep on being incorrect. And that's, I guess, the difference. The old energy modelers are modeling the past and they're modeling the new in linear terms. But in reality, if you model the new and you model in exponential terms, and you assume that it pushes out the old, which is incidentally is exactly how it worked, for example, in mobile phones or the internet or other technology transitions, that gives you a much better sense of the future. And the big problem with the kind of current modeling community, or large parts of the current modeling community, is they're modeling the future, as it were, on the production plans of Nokia for mobile phones. And it doesn't matter what the production plans of Nokia for mobile phones are when the iPhone came along.
You've mentioned this exponential growth. Can you give us some sense of where we are today and the vast leaps forward that we're seeing? And in particular, this is a story you referenced to China, which is often rather more opaque to us here in the West, certainly to me.
Sure. So, in terms of exponential growth, is clearly linked to learning rates. So we have these learning rates of these new energy technologies, whereby their costs are falling by around 20% for every doubling of deployment. And they just keep on falling. It's very well known the cost of solar has fallen by about 80%, but cost of batteries fallen by about 80% over the last decade. And they just keep on falling. For example, last year, solar panel prices, halved, battery prices fell by a further 20%. So you have, on the one hand, this sort of exponential fall in costs. On the other hand, you have an exponential growth in deployment. And again, to give you a few observations or statistics, solar deployment last year was 440 gigawatts, a doubling on the year before. And these are absolutely enormous numbers. When you have a 220 gigawatt system, to double it is really something that very, very few people would have anticipated, including us, actually. Even that level of growth is more than we expected. So anyway, you've got a doubling in solar last year, you've got a tripling in battery deployment last year. And this is part of a very long sequence which has been going on for 20 years or more, whereby solar, in fact, has been doubling every 2 or 3 years for 20 or 30 years. So it is a long-standing exponential, which can be modeled on classic S-curves, and you can seek to model those S-curves forward in various different ways. And then the other really important aspect of this energy transition is that it is driven by China. And what that means is that we need to move a little bit outside our comfort zone and our frame of reference. And I'll give you one classic example. So people often say to me in the last month or so, look, you're wrong. The energy transition is over because offshore wind in the United States is facing all kinds of problems. Therefore, that's not going to grow. Therefore, the story's over. And the point is that's a problem for the US, and it's a problem for the offshore wind in this industry in the US. But it doesn't really matter for the global energy transition, because US offshore wind is 1 gigawatt out of over 500 gigawatts that were installed last year. So what you have to do is you have to look at the leader, and the leader currently is China. And China is deploying this stuff at extraordinary speed. So, for example, last year, again, your listeners will know this, but last year, China deployed more solar than the rest of the world combined, but also more solar than Europe or the United States had deployed in 50 years, in a single year, in one country. And the very similar story going on in the electric vehicle market. People are talking a lot about problems with the electric vehicle market in the US. Well, okay, fine. That is clearly an issue right now. But if you look at the leader, China, it's over 30% of sales last year, and people are already talking about one car in two being an electric vehicle for sales in China this year, by the end of this year, 2024. So when you take China as your framework of reference, you get a very, very different perspective, both as to what is possible and how quickly change is happening.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about some of the, I guess, the potential inhibitors that are particular to the West, given their system of government around policies and planning and so forth. I guess the flip side, firstly, can you just very quickly orientate us as to what percentage of global power is produced by renewables and what percentage of Chinese power is produced by renewables? And then can you talk about I guess the flip side of this exponential growth is you also argue, therefore, that we're going to see, or have seen indeed, peak carbon much earlier than expected and impact in key parts of the West. We've already seen it.
So when it comes to renewables, you've got two types. Well, there's so many types of renewables, but from our perspective, analytically, there are two core groups of renewables. You've got solar and wind, which are the drivers of change. These are the technologies which have the exponential, and they're currently about 14% of global electricity supply. However, it's much more interesting than that, because you don't want to look at the stock. You want to look at the flow, at the change. And again, your listeners will be very, very well aware of this. You want to look at the change, not the total. And they are about 80 or 90%. And in fact, this year, there will be essentially 100% of the net growth in supply of electricity. Last year, they were 500 out of 600 terawatt hours in growth came from solar and wind alone. So they are a relatively small size of the total, but they're making up all of the growth, and it's the growth that matters.
Yeah, and then can you talk about that sort of the corollary, the obverse of that piece, which is where we stand in carbon? Because obviously last year the world burnt more, has produced more greenhouse gas emissions than ever before, and that's been a constant trend.
Yes, it is. It's obviously a real issue. But again, we're talking about change at the margin, and we're looking at when the growth of these technologies is driving peaks in demand for the fossil fuel technologies. And so what we're seeing a series of peaks. So, for example, if you take the data from the International Energy Agency, industrial demand for fossil fuels actually peaked all the way back in 2014, because the speed with which China electrified its industrial sector meant that the net growth in all demand since then has actually come from electricity, not from fossil fuels. We had a peak in building demand in 2018, a peak in ICE demand in 2017. And in 2023, both we, EMBA, International Energy Agency, and most other commentators think that fossil fuel demand peaked in electricity as well. Again, the numbers are very easy to do. You've got solar and wind coming in with 500 last year, probably about 800 or 900 terawatt hours of growth this year in a system which normally grows around 600 terawatt hours a year. Might be a bit more than, might be quite a lot more than that, but again, that's easy to see. So you're getting peaks, clear, obvious peaks, as a result of exponential change happening in one sector after the next. And of course, it's also one country after the next. It's worthwhile remembering that OECD fossil fuel demand peaked in 2007, and every single sector, end sector of fossil fuel demand across the OECD has long ago peaked. The real driver of change has been China, and now as China too is coming towards its peak, that means that the global peak cannot be far away.
Yeah, and that cell phone analogy comes in. It's sort of the developing economies are probably going to leap to these new technologies rather than going through the traditional models and changes that you alluded to earlier. Okay, let's talk about drivers for this exponential growth. The first one is obviously sounds obvious, which is the need to address climate change, but it's actually there's a broader inevitable policy response that you highlight as a result of climate change and energy security and a whole sort of bundle of a changing world and a changing geopolitical landscape and a serious imminent threat?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of drivers of change, but let's start with the very easiest one, which is it's just cheaper. And that ultimately has driven change in many other technology areas. There are always barriers, always difficulties, but at the end of the day, a little bit like sunlight coming into a room with curtains, or water coming through a boat. I mean, these technologies do find solutions, and when they have the cost advantage. So basically, that is your core and your initial, not your initial, that's your core driver right now, the superior economics. And it plays out both very, very clearly now, both in the electricity sector and the light transportation sector, and it's starting to play out in other sectors across the system. But then, a series of other drivers, as you alluded to, you've got security, energy security. And I always smile because people have been saying, well, because of energy security, we need to have more fossil fuels. And you just go and take a look at the map of the world. Only 5% of people live in petrostates. Like 80% of countries import their fossil fuels. Everybody's got loads of renewable potential. So, we calculated, for example, that renewables are 100 times bigger than fossil fuels as an energy source. So for almost every single country in the world, with the exception, I guess, of kind of Singapore or the Vatican, you can just put up renewables and you have energy security. So energy security is another absolutely supreme driver to encourage people to adopt these renewable technologies. And then, you've got a series of other drivers which are also very significant. I mean, global warming and the pollution consequences of fossil fuels, again, are significant, so that we can create a planet in which we can all actually live and our children can live and there is a future. And there's also the very obvious, but I think sometimes overlooked point that this is a kind of race to the top for the energy technologies of the future. So put yourself back in 1900, and they've just kind of invented this thing called the motor car, and they've invented, electricity, and everyone around you telling that the horse is the horse is the future, and gas lighting's here to stay. Actually, it wasn't, and it's exactly the same now. More switched on companies are realizing that the future lies in these renewable energy technologies, these clean energy, clean technologies, and they are therefore pouring money and resources into dominating these industries of the future. That's what China started doing very intelligently about 20 years ago. The US with the IRA, now Europe with its Green New Deal, and many other countries are kind of joining the party. It's now a race to the top.
Out of interest, do you think, therefore, when you put that energy security lens on, and the getting away from being held hostage by petrostates, plus the efficiency, the technology, that ultimately the lower cost, would this be happening in the absence of the imperative of climate change, do you think? And in some ways, you could argue that because climate change has this outsized political angle to it and polarizing aspect to it, it might actually be going faster.
Well, that's a very interesting thought experiment. And I think that for people who are less excited about climate change or pollution as a driver, it is absolutely worthwhile saying that this change will happen regardless. The reason to speed it up is because of the consequences of continuing to pollute with impunity. But yeah, sure, it's a superior, local, cheaper technology. Why wouldn't you do it? And I think to a degree, people often talk about agency, and I guess the point is that the reason why we still have agency is because if you did nothing, this technology transition, like so many others before it, would happen over the period of a century. But to a degree, we don't have a century, and that's why we need to be pushing.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insight call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
Can we talk about these S-curves? Can you help us understand? You've mentioned them before. What are they and why are they crucial to this discussion?
So what an S-curve is, again, I mean, just if you think from one's own experience, first of all, there were very few people who had internet access, and then a lot of people got it in the United States, and then a lot of people got it in various other countries, and then it spread around the world. And incidentally, as an aside, I think I'm right in saying that only as late as 2018 that 50% of the world got internet access. So the way change works is that it goes up an S-curve in leading countries, and then it kind of diffuses out from there. And the way an S-curve works is that you get some early adopters, and they buy the iPhones, the initial iPhones, as it were. And then some other people go, wow, that's quite cool technology, and they buy some more. And then you get a very rapid and extremely consistent pattern taking place where you cross sort of 5% market share, and then 5 or 10 years later, you're at 80% market share. And we've kind of seen that. You go all the way back to the deployment of cars from the 1930s, albeit somewhat held back by the Second World War, but the deployment of radios or TVs. And interestingly enough, there's this academic called Grubler, and he's done this analysis for how it worked out with canals and roads and railways back in the 19th century. And they also have this extraordinary S-curve pattern whereby you go very quickly from 5% penetration to 80% penetration in a relatively small period of time. And that, I guess, is the point, is that we observe much forecasting of the energy system, and a lot of it is very linear. So, the IEA, which has now fortunately radically changed the way it's forecasting, but the IEA used to forecast the growth of solar in linear terms. You installed 10 gigawatts last year, therefore for the next 30 years we assume you'll install 10, and then 3 years later you install 30, so they assume you'd install 30. Now, if you start putting S curves on the assumptions, you go from 10 to 30 to 80 to 100 to 200 to 400, so on and so forth. So that really is the difference between a kind of classic pedestrian linear modeling approach and taking an exponential growth approach.
Okay, thanks for putting that in place. Just going back to a previous comment, because it does fascinate me. So the arguments that are made is this would happen anyway. It's simply the timelines are going to shrink because of the imperative around climate change. That presumably comes from both, at some point, and consumer demand, and buying choices, but also policy support. In terms of an accelerator, where do we see that policy support? And indeed, and China, because this is going to be relevant to the inhibitors, China has so much more capacity just to direct policy than what we see in the West.
Yeah, policy support is certainly important. I mean, actually, the main role, this is very well known, I'm sure, but policy plays different roles in different sectors at different stages of the transition. So, at an early stage, you need policy support to get technologies off the ground, to do R&D, to find solutions, and that, for example, is where the innovation in the United States and in Australia and Germany and others were very important to get solar off the ground in 30, 40 years ago. So you need it there. Then as time goes on and these technologies are able to compete in economic terms, the role of policymaking changes. And actually at the moment in many, many areas, the role of policymakers, in fact, is to create a level playing field and remove the artificial barriers to change, which are stopping the deployment of these technologies. So, for example, the building codes, which say that you can't use cement without specific amounts of carbon in it, or the regulations which stop you from deploying solar or building grids. All of that needs to kind of get retooled for a new era. So the role of policy is extremely important. And I think then if you examine the gap between Chinese policy and Western policy, it is indeed a race to the top. And China at the moment is doing this more rapidly than is happening in the US and Europe. And to substantiate that point, if you look at the time it takes to get permits, for example, for deploying solar, the IEA has done a very interesting analysis of this, and it just takes a lot longer. And I think the answer to that one is, well, if other countries wish to compete for the technologies of the future, with China, who is leading, they will have to change the way that they're operating, and they're going to have to change quite quickly. And of course, if they don't wish to compete, that's also fine, but they are going to find themselves falling behind. And the kind of new technologies and new industries which are being built up at speed now will go to other countries which do it.
Which is a real challenge. I guess we're creeping into these inhibitors because, as you say, we've had or will have, depending on when this goes out, Peter Staley of Cassidy and Associates on talking about just the complexity of getting through the planning process, even around, the things like the IRA, where you've got real policy support and incentives, but actually getting through the policies getting through to the planning stage is very, very challenging. And part of that is, in the West, you have very powerful incumbents. Bill Nussey was on the podcast. We talked about this, mentioning how powerful the utilities were, who obviously are not keen to allow distributed generation at the city level, the neighborhood level, the house level, and thereby make their massive investments in grid infrastructure worthless. So you've got these, that obviously is not a lens that impacts in China.
Yeah, I mean, when you have barriers, you can either weaponize them or you can solve them. And there are some countries which are putting the effort into solving. There are others which are kind of hiding behind them. But I think what's interesting, Paul, when it comes to this debate, don't forget that we have been hearing this argument for decades about one impediment after another. We didn't have, a couple of years ago, we didn't have enough cobalt, and then, we didn't have enough land, we didn't have enough this, that, and the other, and now it's permits. And what has happened, incidentally, every single time is that humanity is pretty brilliant, and we keep on finding new solutions. So, for example, at the moment, I read this report from the US Department of Energy, and there's 26 new solutions for solving the fact that it's difficult to build grids. So, they range from putting more batteries out on the grid edge, to dynamic line management, to upgrading the lines, to demand side response. So there are actually, people often focus on the barriers, but there's actually a whole suite of clever digital type solutions which are coming to solve even these problems. So I totally agree with the brilliant Bill Nussey and this kind of type of problem that we face with incumbents trying to block change. But the glory of these small modular technologies is that they just keep on getting adopted. They keep on finding solutions. And, for example, last year, this is not that well known, but half of the global solar installations were at a household level. And that's pretty hard to block. And now most solar that's going in is going in with batteries. So suddenly you've got cheap batteries, cheap solar, most consumers all across the world clamoring to get this stuff done. And then, you've got some countries where the incumbents are able to block change for a period. But that is only a temporary block, I would suggest. Ultimately, as you see your neighbors deploying this stuff at speed and at scale, you're going to want to do it yourself.
Okay, right. Excellent. Okay, so if I think back through all of our episodes, all of which have some lens on the energy transition, and to your point about cobalt, as we record today, cobalt's at basically an all-time low price. One suite of arguments, and we've had, and I guess there's sort of the Václav Smil camp, and part of that's kind of this EROI, the energetic return on investment. We've had Adam Rosenzweig talking about that. This sort of concept, if you remove dollars, which can be construed by policy, by all these other things, you just look at the energy units in and the energy units out. Renewables are, in their analysis, are half that of oil, for example. And you've got this sort of fundamental sort of surplus issue there. And then the other sort of the Mark Mills camp, which sort of, is this idea that it's just going to take much, much longer than expected because the amount of, because we are moving to technology, we're moving to hardware, essentially, rather than, fuel. It's going to take an incredible amount of moving Earth around to achieve this. what's sort of the response on that broader camp?
So, as you would expect, Paul, we have thought through all of these issues in some detail. So let me start, if I may. Well, let me start with Václav Smil. So Václav Smil is a little bit like Thomas Malthus. He's very good on the past, but completely wrong in the future. So, and those people who are kind of using Smil as a prop to understand the future will find themselves losing a lot of money, because his analysis completely misses the elephant in the room, which is the exponential growth of these new energy technologies. It kind of focuses on the 20 or 30%, which is difficult to solve, and ignores the 60 or 70% where exponential change is happening extremely rapidly. Let me then move on to energy return on investment. Again, here I'm very confident in my analysis. I am, if I may say so, a professional financial analyst, and the analysis which is being done on eROI by most of the incumbents is flat wrong. They're using the wrong numbers, the wrong data, the wrong interpretation. And the person who's the global expert on this is a guy called Marco Rauge, who in fact is another Oxford person. And if you look at Marco Rauge's analysis, the eROI of fossil fuels is extremely low. It's sub 10 now for oil and gas and coal, and it's above 20 for solar and wind, and it keeps rising. And the reason why is because if you take your oil and you burn it, which is what you have to do in order to get any movement, you're losing 2/3 of your energy immediately. When you get it out of the ground, you have to expend a huge amount of energy to get the stuff out of the ground and refine. So what people are doing, just as an aside in this analysis, is they're not comparing apples with apples. They do, a barrel of oil. They think that the barrel of oil is equivalent to an electron which flicks on the light. It's simply not. You have to burn that barrel. And when you do the analysis properly, the eROI of renewables is far superior to that of fossil fuels. And in fact, therefore, it's one of the reasons why about 10 years ago, I concluded that this was the future. And then when it comes to this sort of final point of yours about
Of Mark Mills.
That it takes time. Of course it takes time. I mean, nobody's suggesting this isn't going to take time. Obviously, it's going to take decades to transition the entire system. But, your listeners think in marginal change terms, as do I as a finance person. And, it's a little bit like saying, you sell hats and, you invest in a business which sells hats, and they're selling 100 hats a year. And you're like, well, I'm only going to sell the shares when they sell one hat. Actually, you want to sell the shares when they're selling 99. And that's the point. You have these enormous systems which are going to get disrupted by superior, fast-growing mammals, as it were. And there's simply no point in sticking around in the dinosaurs, hoping that they can somehow prop themselves up with various different techniques. It's all about marginal change. And then, the final point about the quantum of stuff. This again is absolutely outrageously incorrect. So to be clear, we currently are burning 15,000 million tons of fossil fuels every single year. And we can replace that. My brilliant colleague, Dan Walter, has just done an analysis suggesting that we would need only a one-off extraction of 36 million tons of battery materials to replace all of the oil that we currently need. So we're talking 3 orders of magnitude smaller from the renewable system rather than the fossil fuel system. And again, think about it. It absolutely stands to reason from first principles. If you have to burn something relatively heavy every single day versus just sticking up a solar panel and extracting the electrons from the sunshine, I mean, of course it's lighter.
Let's move on to the I guess some of the outcomes and impacts. And we met at the FT Commodities Summit where there was some rather frosty responses to what we've gone through. But I think you make the case excellently. Just before we talk about the bigger impacts, just one question I have. It seems when it comes to S-curves and the space for technological development, is that really going to be a solar and battery story, or is wind also going to see a similar exponential increase in the technology and capabilities that get them ever more efficient, ever more deployed?
Can I just address your point about the frosty responses and the world of commodity traders? Well, no, if I may. I mean, actually, as I said to quite a few people I spoke to, this framing of the future is absolutely fine for commodity traders because it's going to create a lot of volatility as the system shifts from fossil fuels to renewables. That creates huge opportunities for arbitrage for people who are traders. And ultimately, if you're a trader, you don't really care what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years' time. So actually, I think for commodity traders, this is a marvelous environment to be involved in for at least the next 10 or 20 years. I mean, if, however, you're sitting on fossil fuel assets, which are going to get disrupted and stranded as these superior new technologies continue to grow on their S curves, then then good luck.
Yeah, and we're studiously avoiding hydrogen here, which I think we both share similar views on. Okay, I completely agree, right? I think, and we're going to talk about some of that disruption and that volatility that we're already seeing. We're already seeing that today and have seen it the last 4 years or so. But just that one small point, does wind have the same trajectory, or is it really going to be a solar and battery story?
Wind so far has been able to keep on dropping its costs, and depends where you are in the world, but it's comparable in cost in many places with solar. I think in the very long term, solar is going to be considerably larger than wind, but you will still need large amounts of wind as a way to balance the solar, and specifically for countries and regions such as, for example, the United Kingdom, which sadly rather lack solar and need other solutions. So it's definitely part of the suite of solutions.
Yeah. Okay. One reason why, obviously, this shift from a carbon fuel burning large quantities of stuff to a technology is that you have a massive decrease in the value ultimately of the economic opportunity that sits around energy production, or the production of electricity, production of motion in cars and so forth. We go essentially to a world where electricity becomes very cheap and essentially limitless. It's just how much the technology costs to produce that, compared to a very different and much richer energy sector today. Can you just talk to that a little bit, and what that, do you agree, and what that means?
Well, I've seen, was that book recently saying that because it's not profitable enough, people won't do it. I mean, this is like really feeble analysis, with all due respect. Money, capital flows to technologies which grow, and capital flows to technologies which are the future. And look at the analysis by the brilliant Venezuelan professor Carlota Perez. She completely analyzes this point. And so I'm not at all concerned by this kind of fake argument that there's not enough money, therefore it won't happen. I mean, there's not enough money for incumbents to make money out of this stuff, but it's not stopping the growth happening, because there are other companies which got a lower cost of capital or a better vision of the future. And again, as the innovator's dilemma analyzes in fantastic detail, that's what always happens, is that newcomers figure out how to do it better, find new niches. I've no idea where the value add is going to lie in the energy system in 30 years' time, and nor does anyone else. But the point simply is that if you want to play in that game, you need to be investing in these new energy technologies, and you need to be hunting around for those opportunities.
Yeah, I guess I agree with you. I guess my point is more that has a dramatic impact on the current world order, and which countries are wealthy and which ones aren't, right? I mean, it's going to have a significant reshaping, not just of our technologies and how we produce and consume energy, but also which countries are doing well and which ones have a dramatic decline in fortunes.
Yeah, so the Irina, for example, and Thijs van der Graaf, the very brilliant Thijs van der Graaf, has done very good analysis of what are the geopolitical consequences of the change in the energy system. So, I mean, in broad terms, we at the moment are handing over $1,000 or $2,000 billion of fossil fuel rents every single year, mainly to the petrostates, and then using that money, and that flow of capital to that group of countries will undoubtedly dry up. So therefore, unless they change or reinvent themselves, the capacity of their future generations in their countries to flourish will decline, in the same way as the people who used to extract the guano mines in Peru had to reinvent themselves. So this is absolutely normal for technology shifts. People making super profits out of the old technology think it's going to last forever, but it doesn't, and they have to reinvent themselves.
Where does this, in terms of forecasts, where do you, I guess your analysis lead you to in terms of, the future for fossil fuels versus, say, the IEA or whatever it might be?
Three ways in which people are forecasting the future. So you've got, on the one end of the spectrum, you've got the various different incumbents and their kind of cheerleaders who are forecasting business as usual, no change, everything's fine around here. And that's obviously, the usual suspects, Exxon, EIA, OPEC, and their various different tied banks. And so, that's one group of forecasters. And as I often say, why would you listen to them? It's a little bit like buying a car from a secondhand car salesman. I mean, there is really very little likelihood that their analysis of the future is going to be accurate. They're simply talking their book. So anyway, that's one, but that is one group of people. Your kind of second group is those who have forecasts of how do we get to net zero by 2050. So that is to say, it's a forecast based upon an assumption of where the future will be, and that's also difficult to imagine will necessarily happen because they're expecting all of us to do the right thing and hold hands and do everything perfectly. But then there's this group in the middle where I think we would place ourselves, along with other forecasters such as Bloomberg New Energy Finance or Rystad or folks, for example, at Oxford INET, which is just simply saying, look, we will forecast the rapid exponential growth of new energy technologies, and we will follow the logic through of where that leads to. And that will lead to a peaking in demand for fossil fuels. As I said, we already had a kind of lots of peaks. We get a series of peaks happening this decade. And this decade, it also leads to a massive ramp up in supply of renewable deployment. Again, you see that absolutely everywhere. And then next decade, you will actually get fossil fuel demand starting to come down off its plateau as this renewable stuff gets deployed. So yeah, there are three different groups, and I would suggest that two of them are not particularly credible.
Just a couple of more pieces to get in. Where does this leave the Paris Agreement? And then I want to come on to sort of come full circle and China and the West. But where does this leave the Paris Agreement, which I think you believe is feasible?
Well, where it leaves us, humanity, is it gives us a shot at achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And as you will recall, the Paris Agreement was to get to 2 degrees and seek to get to 1.5. So to be less than 2 degrees is still absolutely within our potential. And indeed, from our analysis, it's what is most likely with the current trajectory of growth up the S-curve of these new energy technologies. So I think we can be fairly optimistic, therefore, from that perspective.
Because you have spent so much time focused on this, I just sort of want to end with kind of like how far China is ahead in the energy transition and how it's absolutely positioned itself, if you were to think in the long view and big geostrategic terms. I mean, it clearly has the potential to own this new industrial revolution that might dominate the next 100 years of human life. I mean, can you give us some, I just finish on that.
So we did an analysis, RMI, of the energy transition, and we looked at two key areas. We looked at the deployment of solar wind within electricity, which is one of the two core drivers, and we looked at the electrification of end uses. And then we looked at deployment and we looked at production. So we kind of fairly simple structure for understanding. And where we currently stand is that in 2024, China is leading in 3 out of the 4 areas. So not everywhere, actually. Europe, in fact, leads in solar and wind as a percentage of electricity generation. And there are plenty of other countries, for what it's worth, which are actually leading in various different pieces. So, for example, the US is leading in software and services for energy deployment. So it is true to say that China is currently leading in most areas. But actually, if you go back 10 years, that was not the case. And if you go forward 10 years, thanks to the ARA, thanks to the European Green New Deal, thanks to the fact that many other countries have now woken up to the opportunity the situation may be completely different. And I think it's worthwhile emphasizing we've only electrified 14% of electricity. Electricity itself is only 20% of final energy demand, a slightly misleading statistic, but anyway, for what it's worth. What that means is that you have huge opportunities right across the spectrum in every single area. Every single energy area of final energy demand is wide open for reinvention right now. And I think for us, we would suggest that the important thing to do is don't chase where the puck has been. There's no point in 2024 trying to beat China in solar manufacturing. Go where the future lies, figure out solutions to new areas. We're still lacking in solutions. Work out how to deploy stuff more rapidly, more effectively, more intelligently, with greater levels of efficiency. That's where the opportunities now lie, and anyone can do that. And I think what's also really interesting now is that you're seeing these leapfrogs taking place, where countries like Vietnam or Chile are actually leapfrogging Europe and the US and electrifying their systems faster than we are. So it's actually a much fairer world, a more just world, and a world absolutely replete with opportunity. So if people say to me, China's won, we should give up, this is completely false framing. China has opened the door, has opened, as it were, Pandora's box. Now we can exploit the opportunities.
Yeah, fabulous. And what we will do is put links to one of your latest presentation in the show notes for people to go view, which is just stuff full of fascinating graphs that backs up all that you say. And, you know, I think it's been fascinating. It's been hopeful as well in terms of this direction of travel. And, you know, I think we'd all agree that if we could not go above 2 degrees, that would be pretty important for anyone living on the coast for sure. But, you know, hopefully, Kingsmill, we can have you on again in a year or so and see where this journey is. And I'll also put links to how they can reach out to you and find you in the show notes as well.
That'd be great. At RMI, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Paul.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.